How does it feel to be a Cleveland Brown?
Feels great. Just blessed to have an opportunity to grow here with Hugh, Pep, and his team. It's been really fun these past couple of days getting to know the new teammates, and it's truly an honor to be in this league. So just glad they gave me an opportunity.
After escaping from the shackles of his previous employer and ex-wife, RG3 came to Cleveland with redemption on his mind. His new head coach Hugh Jackson was something of a quarterback whisperer considering his resume of former pupils. If pedestrian passers like Joe Flacco and Andy Dalton were able to set records and garner Pro Bowl selections under Jackson's tutelage, Operation Revive Robert didn't appear to be the most arduous of tasks. Especially considering Jackson's 18-year bond with Carson Palmer, a fellow Heisman winner who endured an ACL tear of his own upon reaching the pros, but battled back with a remarkable comeback season. Unfortunately, Robert Griffin's reclamation tour immediately hit the skids after fracturing his shoulder in Week 1, effectively ruling him out for the brunt of the season. He returned for the final 4 games of 2016, only one of which he did not lose. Showing no signs of progression in his play style, Cleveland had seen enough and cut Griffin loose with the year remaining on his contract in favor of Kevin Hogan. Free drinks to anybody who was aware of his existence before watching this film. Despite receiving backup offers in 2017, Griffin played the waiting game in hopes that another starting opportunity would materialize. In the meantime, he managed to throw a few digs in the direction of disgruntled Browns fans while accosting his former head coaches Jay Gruden and Mike Shanahan for their two-faced dispositions and mishandling of his career. Social media had contorted from a vessel that once aided Robert's ascension into a podium that now broadcasted his bitterness. His name was synonymous with controversy. But it was his last stop in the league that was truly poetic justice. In 2018, Griffin accepted an offer from the Baltimore Ravens, the team that catalyzed the commencement of his downfall. Griffin III changed his number to match his namesake, and that's how many seasons he would spend providing second-string duty to an emerging racehorse, Lamar Jackson, who happened to share his former predilection for running the ball. In Lamar Jackson, Griffin was given a glimpse of an alternate reality where the Ferrari kept roaring. Jackson's passing ability was called into question before he had ever played a professional football game, yet he remained unfazed. Instead, the Louisville product picked up where RG3's rookie season left off, and shamelessly invoked fear in the hearts of opposing defenders with his blazing speed and agility as a rusher. Only 25 years old as of today, Jackson has won an MVP award and made several playoff appearances, with an abundance of accolades to come. Griffin was let go by Baltimore in the winter of 2021 and subsequently ventured into broadcasting. 9 years after making what some may argue was the most emphatic entrance in league history, Robert Griffin III's NFL career quietly came to an end. Wake up, Indiana. Mr. Wentz is in the building. Having departed from his big city shoes, Carson Wentz was situated in the type of muted environment that he was accustomed to, where he'd be taking instruction from a coach who was his #1 fan and fellow disciple in Christ. The Indianapolis Colts were a talented team that were perceived as being a quarterback away from making a deep playoff run. And after acquiring the former Eagle, the corollary on paper appeared to be a mutualistic relationship in the making. However, the output was anything but atypical, because if your name is Carson James Wentz, chaos is your version of normal. 1 month before the regular season began, the 6-year talent would undergo surgery for a re-aggravated foot injury that had somehow lain dormant since he was a high schooler. Impressively, CJ, as he refers to himself in the Twitter sphere, still managed to make the curtain call for Week 1, but was not out of the woods quite yet. Now wearing number 2, Wentz would proceed to sprain his 2 ankles in Week 2 against the Rams, except LA wouldn't ruin his season for the second time. By now, even Carson was tired of his body failing on him and refused to miss another match, somehow pushing through the levee of pain and rejoining the field to play the following Sunday. The only problem was, the Colts fell to 0-3, What ensued thereafter was a tour de force of the Carson Wentz experience. Triumphant primetime road victories in inclement weather and inexcusable choke job performances countered each other like a game of checkers. Wentz would seamlessly pinball between throwing pick sixes in the end zone one week to flexing his deep ball prowess with ease the next. In spite of the fracas, the Colts were trending upwards, from 1-4 to 4-5 to 8-6, putting the rest of the NFL on notice. Then came Christmas Day against the Arizona Cardinals. Carson was cool, calm, and collected as he dropped dimes on AZ like Santa drops presents, defeating one of the premier teams in football. In a lot of ways, Indy's season played out like the script of a superhero flick. That's likely the reason HBO tabbed them to star in the first mid-season iteration of Hard Knocks, an iconic NFL docuseries. To many viewers, the victory over the Cardinals signified the moment when Wentz finally flipped the switch, when the hero perfected his powers in preparation for a final showdown with fate. With only 2 games remaining, Indianapolis only needed one more win to clinch a playoff berth. In the past, Wentz was frequently bailed out of such postseason and postseason adjacent contests due to a medley of maladies. But even a positive COVID test for the unvaccinated number 2 couldn't disturb his date with destiny. The penultimate match was a home game against the Raiders. Las Vegas committed the only 2 turnovers of the afternoon and were on the unlucky end of one of the luckiest touchdowns you'll ever see. Yet it was the Silver and Black who returned to Sin City with a W. A disappointing defeat for Indy, but the finale was against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the worst team in the NFL. Giving their Floridian rivals a quick spanking before a procession into the playoffs was practically guaranteed. All year, the main catalyst to the Colts' success was running back Jonathan Taylor, who led the NFL in rushing yards, yards from scrimmage, and touchdowns among skill position players. Having an MVP candidate as a proverbial sidekick meant Wentz's primary functions were handing the ball off and intermittently keeping the defense honest by way of the play-action pass. Number 2 still gambled through the air, but his opportunities to do so during the 2021 campaign were curbed to a large extent. Accordingly, the Jaguars had to devise a defensive strategy to disrupt their opponent's offensive rhythm. The agreed upon course of action? Jacksonville would expend their resources exclusively on taking Taylor out of the game. If the Colts were going to win, they'd have to do it strictly via the arm of the quarterback. The following is what transpired.
Another fake to Taylor. Wentz running out of time and had it deflected incomplete. Wentz throws incomplete. Doyle, the intended receiver, from the 38. Under pressure and going down. And the ball back inside the 25-yard line.
And it's second long.
Wentz tripped up.
There.
By the way, Carson Wentz now still has not thrown an interception on the road this season.
Yeah.
Wentz pulls it down once, now throws, intercepted! Damian Wilson with the interception.
Right now, they've got a lot of fire under this offense.
Wentz decides not to throw it, pulls it down, goes down. As we approach 2 minutes to play here in the third. First and goal. Wentz had to pull it down and he goes down.
Your best player.
Taylor. There is no touchdown signal. The Jaguars made the stand. Still in action, so Indianapolis not a... Boy, what a depressing loss for Indianapolis here today, and what a stunning victory for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They finished.
The Colts' worst nightmare came true as they wet the bed and awakened to the stunning realization that their season was over. Favored to win by 15, they lost by an identical margin. Jaguars fans showed up to the game masquerading as clowns in protest of their own franchise's incompetence. But the joke was on Indy. After cutting his turnovers down to the lowest rate in his 6 years under center, Carson James Wentz picked the most consequential game of his career to cough up the rock and throw his only road interception of 2021. In the final deuce of the season, with all of the chips on the table and a 97% chance of clinching a postseason berth, Wentz failed to throw for 200 yards, couldn't toss more than a singular touchdown, and completed under 60% of his attempts in both contests against adversity-ridden ball clubs that both fired their head coaches mid-season. This was still the same flawed quarterback, except he lucked into the right system, or rather the Reich system, that coddled and covered up the gaping holes in his gameplay. And like the Jaguars' 3-14 record, things were coming full circle for the Dakota Kid.
Just didn't get it done, and it hurts right now. A lot of reflection to come over the next handful of days, unfortunately, but yeah, it's not a good feeling right now.
Because soon thereafter, the football world would be deja vu inundated with complaints from the Colts organization regarding everybody's least favorite red-headed stepchild. After the same grievances were aired about his leadership deficiencies and inability to elevate his teammates from the team's owner. After his general manager scolded his tendency to overcomplicate the offense. And after his biggest believer, who was with him from the very beginning, finally threw in the towel on his prodigal son, an individual once deemed worthy of being the highest paid player in football appeared to be dead in the water. Except there was one and only one remaining ball club interested in obtaining his services. The Washington Commanders. Carson Wentz was being dealt to DC, much to the amusement and ridicule of the general public.
Everything about this surprises me, except for the fact that Carson Wentz stinks and another team's going to get to find out about it.
This is it for Carson Wentz. If he doesn't show it this year, I don't think he's going to be a starter again in this league.
No way another NFL team would be that dumb to trade for Wentz. Like,
as a lifelong diehard Dallas Cowboy fan, I am not threatened. I'm happy. Yeah.
When I found out the news about Carson Wentz, if there had been a vat of acid in front of me at that moment, I would have splashed myself directly in the face. I started screaming.
Why are you complaining? That's the best quarterback you've had in like 2 decades, which is actually correct.
It's not true. We had like 9 games of RG3.
Right, but
it's got to be a nightmare for the fans of the Commanders. Yeah, Carson Wentz, man. I don't know. That's tough. That's tough. That's tough.
Determining who or what is responsible for the ruination of Robert Griffin III and Carson Wentz's football careers is a contentious topic that, despite being discussed ad nauseum, has lacked a clear answer. That ends now. To the naked eye of many, it is tempting to believe that these two would still be lighting up the league, possibly forming the NFL's best in-division quarterback rivalry, if their health didn't continue creeping up on them, much in the manner of Jason Voorhees and his predilection for stealthily producing casualties at Camp Crystal Lake. But what many don't know is number 10 and number 11 have flirted with injury all of their lives. Once upon a time, Robert Griffin tore his ACL in the same knee while at Baylor, 2 years before he made his way to the forefront of the football world's consciousness. Carson Wentz, during his senior year at North Dakota State, broke the wrist of his throwing hand and missed more than half of the season, but in his first game back won the national championship before killing it at the combine and turning the heads of scouts league-wide. However, the pros are a far more vicious animal than collegiate play, which is why a regression in their initial NFL returns was a given, but doesn't explain the following seasons when they had regained much of their burst and athleticism. For comparison, Falcons quarterback Michael Vick broke his leg in 2003, yet had the second best rushing output of his professional career in 2004. Despite having access to inferior medical care. There are those who point the finger at the hot and cold treatment they received from the fans and media alike. It's true that popular opinion can be fickle. Robert Griffin III was one of the first victims of what occurs when social media virality and real-world fame collide. Even his agent was likely exhilarated but also overwhelmed with the asinine amount of endorsement deals being offered to his client. Then as soon as Robert pumped out a few mediocre performances, that same contingent of devotees and enablers suddenly went from immersing themselves in all things RG3 to becoming cutthroat critics of his every move. Likewise, in Philadelphia, Carson Wentz was lauded by the most demanding American sports market one second, and the next watching Nick Foles statues being erected before he even had a chance to answer his backup's accomplishment. Yet in terms of notoriety, the access that fans and the media have to athletes is only intensifying as this society enters its last days. It's a chaotic storm, but one that many of their peers have successfully weathered. Griffin and Wentz endured far more tomfoolery within their organization, some will contest. The shenanigans of Dan Snyder are well known. A dissertation regarding his rap sheet isn't difficult to find. Yet the rapid speed at which he went from cherishing RG3 like the last loaf of bread during a natural disaster to discarding him like a bag of dirty pennies was puzzling. The same could be said for Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman, signing Carson Wentz to the football equivalent of an NBA max contract, then sending mixed signals by firing the coach who no longer wanted to work with him, but drawing a line in the sand as it pertained to pitting him against a rookie and trading Wentz 2 months later. The Cleveland Browns have been a perpetual dumpster fire for much of the current millennium, and the Colts have a harder time keeping a quarterback in stock than the PlayStation 5 supply of major retailers worldwide. But for all of the headaches that these gentlemen have endured, and they endured a lot, how have the supporting characters associated with their tragedy arcs turned out? Kirk Cousins has remained a serviceable starter for the past 7 seasons with entrenched job security on the Minnesota Vikings. Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur, and Sean McVay have all become wildly successful head coaches of premier teams in the NFC, with the latter winning a Super Bowl. Despite the Eagles having a first-year head coach and questionable talent pool, Jalen Hurts and company overachieved expectations and qualified for the playoffs in 2021, during what was largely perceived as a rebuilding year. Doug Peterson took a 1-year sabbatical after being fired and then was immediately courted to become the Jaguars' next head coach. Indianapolis, less than a month after dealing Wentz away, was finally able to acquire an upper echelon quarterback, somebody who was actually won Most Valuable Player, not an almost MVP award. Even the Cleveland Browns managed to win a playoff game, a feat that Griffin and Wentz have yet to do. So adhering to the common denominator theory, why is it that these gentlemen became generators of dysfunction wherever they turned? The unabashed truth is, Carson Wentz and Robert Griffin III achieved success by means of wildly unsustainable methods and machinations. But based on their pre-NFL history, could you fault them for their hubris? In 2012, during pre-draft evaluations of Robert Griffin, the Shanahans realized that the Baylor prospect was behind the curve in regard to his grasp of running a pro-style offense. Even after installing a much simpler read-based option approach, much like what Griffin ran at Baylor, they had to further pare down his duties to reading only one side of the field. That was the spark that jolted the Redskins in 2012 from their 3-6 record to embarking on the 7-game win streak that won Robert Rookie of the Year. But Robert couldn't stay healthy because of his refusal to slide. By his own admission, if any inch of green was in his purview, he was going for it. But rather than modifying his run style in the wake of his second ACL tear, he concluded that he needed to reinvent himself as a pocket passer.
And, my job is not to go out there and try to run. I only run if I have to, and that's the way I look at it.
Having graduated from high school and college at an accelerated pace, Griffin figured he could work the same magic as it pertains to becoming a pocket passer. But unlike his record-breaking accolades as a track and field runner, this was a hurdle far too intricate for one to simply sprint over. How ironic that the man who once wore an emblazoned Operation Patience shirt was lacking just that. Kirk Cousins was selected as an insurance policy. He possessed the superior skill set to operate a conventional scheme and therefore was given more leeway upon gameplay insertion. This made for an uneasy dynamic in the quarterback room because despite the confidence that Griffin carried himself with, he knew he was staring down a peer who could outplay him in the most important facet of a quarterback's repertoire: throwing the football. This forced Griffin's hand into re-entering those Seattle and Baltimore games to preserve his job, which he at least took responsibility for years later. Carson Wentz's brand of backyard football is no different. He'll risk it for the biscuit and overextend himself on any and every given play. The self-control of a kid in a candy store. A bull in a china shop. Wreck the Porsche before you even hand him the car keys. The rural rebel maintained a 4.0 GPA for the entirety of his high school and collegiate education. and his self-convictions were inflated by his tenure at North Dakota State, where he handily conquered the FCS subdivision. When you couple Carson's tendency to spurn the play calling of his coaches with the burden that Wentz felt to compete with the success of Nick Foles, it formed a dark cloud that soiled the remainder of his Eagles tenure. Unfortunately, our two subjects ignored many of the omens preceding their downfalls. At Redskins Park, Doug Williams, the first African-American quarterback to win a Super Bowl, had an office at the facility with an open door policy that encouraged members of the roster to stop by for words of wisdom. It was mentorship that many players on the team would utilize, but Griffin was not amongst them. Robert overlooked one of the few individuals capable of empathizing with him, for it was Williams who paved the way for future generations of black quarterbacks such as Griffin to not only be tolerated, but cherished. Whereas his peers, Russell Wilson and Cam Newton, heeded the words of preceding trailblazers such as Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, and Donovan McNabb, nobody could crack the code of RG3. And it was this general lack of guidance that laid the stones for the poor judgment calls of scolding his teammates publicly, rebuking his coaches, incessant social media usage, and boasting of his greatness despite devolving into one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. This is why RG3 had an embarrassment of offensive masterminds at his disposal while in Washington, but was outplayed by the likes of Colt McCoy. Carson Wentz took umbrage with Eagles teammates taking to the press to air out their frustrations towards him instead of hashing things out man to man, but does his reputation precede him? During Philadelphia's Super Bowl run, Wentz was nearly cold-cocked by teammate Darren Sproles, after Carson declared that his contributions to the team were being taken for granted, and shared his ambivalence at the prospect of Philly taking home the title without him. Fear of missing out is human nature, but openly vocalizing your displeasure towards your coworker's success is a confession that only truth serum should be able to muster from the team captain of all folks. Why should any of your teammates trust you after hearing such an egocentric revelation? Whereas the average member of society will recognize the errors in their approach and find a way to adjust after a setback, Griffin and Wentz refused to evolve. As these brothers from unrelated mothers progressed through their 20s, they only became more set in their nonconformist ways, which blundered their comeback attempts upon migrating to new franchises, while failing to discern why this cycle continues to repeat itself. Instead, when things go wrong, Wentz goes God, often classifying the sinking ship that is his career as divine prejudgment. But getting benched and playing for 3 teams in 3 years is not a part of God's plan. It's no different than a secular player arguing that the NFL is simply a business and trades are inevitably routine. You aren't going anywhere in the National Football League, especially as a quarterback, if you're performing at a high level. That same delusion is why RG3 was emboldened enough to assert himself as still being starter material as recently as last year. There's been a lot of negative discourse to this point in time surrounding Griffin and Wentz because that's what these two have given the world. But they've also made history and briefly shown everyone how lethal they could be when operating in the proper headspace. For all of their athletic exploits, Griffin and Wentz had their best outputs in 2012 and 2017 by simply trusting the process, allowing coaches to do their jobs, and leaning on their teammates instead of playing hero ball. Truth be told, there exists no quote-unquote optimal personality traits. It's merely a matter of regulating what makes you, you. And just like football, life is a team game, and no man is an island. Taking advantage of their surrounding support systems was the key to reaching their once lofty heights, and it's what would have kept them on a linear path towards superstardom. If there was one word to summarize the careers of our protagonist, it would be strange. Better yet, uncanny. Both drafted number 2 overall into the NFC East after their teams gave up the jackpot to acquire them. Each produced one stellar season at the inception of their careers, which quickly catapulted them into being propagated as future faces of the NFL. Unfortunately, their enthralling campaigns both ended in ACL tears that shifted their life paths into disappointing directions, as an influx of external stimuli overwhelmed them into egregious behavior. Carson Wentz had his best season during the year in which Robert Griffin III was unemployed. And when Wentz was capsized, it was none other than Griffin who appeared on ESPN to lobby in his stead. A year prior, the Cleveland Browns passed on Wentz to grab Griffin, and in Carson's NFL debut, he faced off against the one and only, until their mutual motif of injuries prematurely concluded their clash. Like Griffin, Wentz is now on his third team with no guaranteed money left on his deal after 2022. It is now or never for the North Dakota native. This could be his swan song, following in the footsteps of his predecessor, in a narrative they could settle for. But the 2020s has already had too many depressing endings, and it is time for a tale of triumph. A decade after taking the NFL by storm, RG3 finds himself receiving rave reviews in the role of a sports talk anchor, giving him the optimal outlet to let his charisma and opinionated personality shine. 10 years after number 10 lit up the league, his number neighbor is now tasked with doing the same. A new start that coincides with Washington's new name and future stadium, along with an opportunity to overcome the demons of his past. Robert and Carson possess the requisite skill to flourish this fall, but they must approach their assignments with sustained humility and finesse. There's a very thin line between confidence and arrogance, so remember, in this world, man is either made humble or made to be humbled. But it's not about how you fall, it's how you get back up. So how do these near parallel parables end? Luckily for these two gentlemen, the future is still unwritten.